This podcast segment is for entertainment purposes only. The views and opinions expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the segment does not imply an endorsement of them or an entity they represent. It also does not reflect the view of imno.expert and any of its affiliated companies or brands. If you have any questions on the disclaimer, please reach out to connect.imno.expert@gmail.com.
And welcome to another episode here at I'm No Expert. Recent interview of former President Ranil Wickremesinghe has been going super viral. And I'm here today with two political analysts that I've brought together into the studio to help us make sense of what is actually going on. Is there more to this interview than we know? Are we quick to judge, especially in Colombo and I would say a majority of the world? So I have here with me Kusum Vijay Tilaka, analyst who's been here on I'm No Expert before, and of course Natasha Maurice from Perspective South, also a political analyst who has been here as well. Yes. And we're about to kind of break down what exactly this interview with former President Ranil Wickremesinghe on Al Jazeera, how it went down, and how we can actually go about understanding to formulate our own opinion about it. And also be a little bit more aware of what's going on. Cool. So let's just break it down. We had an interview, Al Jazeera. Head-to-head is an actual show that's been done before. Is that really... Okay, this is my first thing. Me being somebody that just doesn't understand politics to the full extent, I'm watching this. It didn't really feel like an interview to me. And any of you can start, but I'll throw it on to you, Kusum. Was this a normal interview? Do interviews, are they conducted like this?
They are conducted like this on head-to-head, which is specifically meant to be a combative, aggressive, sort of non-compromising interview format. Mehdi Hassan is someone who has sort of built a brand around that. And frankly speaking, I mean, there's no other way that kind of interview was going to go. If you watched any of his previous interviews, every single interview, he's been remarkably consistent with his style and his sort of aggressive demeanor. Having said that, I think this was sort of a branding exercise. That's how I first saw it. I'm kind of changing my mind. I think Ranil Wickremesinghe needed a little bit of a glow because I think he finds himself sort of revered. Because if you look at his profile on paper, right, he's a guy who's a 6-time prime minister, 1-time president, former cabinet minister of everything from education to industry to finance to defense. So on paper, this guy is an elite level Sri Lankan. But, and I think he wanted to go and show himself to be this guy who rescued Sri Lanka, during the economy and all of this. And ultimately got shown up.
Yeah. So if I could just pull out of the interview, if you don't mind,
sure,
Jason,
yeah.
like we usually do.
Yeah.
So you pull out of this interview, and some of the main comments that are coming out on a question of, is this good journalism?
I heard that.
And that might be, a question that you could also answer because it's also to do with production in that sense. And I'd like to pull out, and there are quite a few people who say, yes, this is good journalism. And I'd like to pull out, and I'd like to say, to me, my perspective, this is not good journalism. It's not even a good conversation. And like Kusum said, this is fundamentally what he's known for. I've seen a few comments online that talk about him being a hate peddler in that sense. But then we ask the question from ourselves, what is good journalism to you? And to me, it's the presenting or allowing to be presented
Right.
different aspects, different voices, different narratives, different contexts of a very complex, protracted issue so that the consumers of that media or communication can actually arrive at a deeper understanding of the context of that issue. Right. To me, that is what good journalism is. It's not polarization, it's not dichotomy of two camps in order to sort of feed into an algorithmic hate. That's not what I feel is good journalism.
Right.
So
just to jump in there, you said algorithmic hate, and I feel like that is specifically you're talking about content that is generated for social media traction, right?
yeah, I mean, I feel like, of course, social media, because we're talking about algorithms, we're talking about social media. I feel like everything is algorithmic now because I feel like social media leads so many of the things that we do that already, and because of, I mean, we're not going to go into a discussion of AI,
Sure.
but you would know, both of you would already know, you have a conversation, like you're having a conversation in this room right now. Your phones are with you, and then you go out, and your search engine already knows what you want to be hearing or what you want to be seeing, right? And there's a word for it, I think it's called, it'll come to me, but we're categorized in that way.
Right.
But also then...
Like a profiling kind of
Yeah,
thing,
it's a profiling, and it's a bias, a confirmation bias, that's what it's called.
Okay.
And so your search engine and my search engine, we might be searching the same thing, but it's not giving us the same hits.
Right.
It's specifically personalized
Right.
to your biases. And we are basing a lot of what we do on that. The circles of people we hang out with, the conversations we have, we're basing it on that. So I feel like we really need to pull out from this. I think I've watched the interview about 3 times now, and we really need to pull out and ask the question from ourselves of what is good journalism to me?
Yeah. To add to what you were saying about from a producer's perspective, right? When we make good TV or we're making a show, we're cutting up the best bits. And so I did feel there was a lot of, just from my first glance at it, I was like, oh, this feels a little bit one-sided. He didn't kind of let the former president speak as much. But yeah.
Sorry, and I think there was like a debriefing where I saw the former president, Ranil Wickremesinghe, speaking, and he said something like, well, it was a 2-hour interview and they only aired 1 hour, but it was actually only 49 minutes.
Okay.
So it was a 2-hour interview, according to him, but only 49 minutes was aired.
Right. Right. What do you think about that, Cousin?
So I agree with I think it's an interesting conversation about journalism more broadly. I'd like to stick to the fact that this was consistent. Like it's not like Mehdi hasn't presented a different side of himself.
Right.
This was completely consistent with everything that's come before.
Right.
And Al Jazeera is a network TV channel,
Yeah.
right? So it's kind of an entertainment business.
Okay.
So I think on previous episodes, let's take Eric Prince, who was a defense contractor. He was on Al Jazeera with Mehdi Hassan. Ehud Barak, former Israeli Prime Minister. Pretty much the same format. Didn't go very well for the guest. They were on the back foot. They were being attacked relentlessly. So this is incredibly consistent with every other program they've had. I think the point is that, yeah, you should expect a more rounded narrative. But I think if you're, like, for example, if this was on CNN, would you be surprised that there wasn't much of a rounded narrative? Not really, because you know that there's a bias there. With Al Jazeera, so if you have a program on Israel or Palestine on Al Jazeera versus CNN or BBC, you already know you have to have some kind of understanding. I know this is a problem with new media, with media in general, is that you have to sort of understand the biases of what you're reading. Like if in Sri Lanka, if you're reading the Daily News or the Daily Mirror or the Island, you should know what kind of perspectives they're coming from. And you should be able to sort of filter information. It is a complicated thing. I don't know about this idea that Mr. Wickremesinghe didn't get a chance to speak, because I heard him reel off a completely unrelated story on Buddhism and the Buddha. I heard him reel off, and I think the other point we didn't mention is that a lot of politicians in Sri Lanka, especially former presidents who've been at the highest level, Mr. Wickremesinghe being at the highest level for 30 years, when you're asked a question in a format like this by a journalist on the international stage, you can't be evasive. And the problem that I think, if I was interviewing him, I'm not as aggressive as Mehdi Hassan. So I would have let him go on and make some kind of political statement before I interject. So Mehdi Hassan's seen this on his show multiple times. It was the same with Israeli officials. He's pretty much made a name for himself in the last 2 years just on his interviews with Israeli officials related to the war crimes in Gaza, right? So this is his style. And I think the whole point of Mr. Wickremesinghe being there is to reiterate the Sri Lankan government's position.
Right.
And there were so many things that he could have done to sort of reiterate his own sort of record, because I think Nirj Dev Aditya brought up this. He said, you've kind of got the wrong man on stage, because throughout the conflict, Ranil Wickremesinghe sort of found himself on what was called the LTT sympathizers, appeasers. That was how the nationalist view painted him. I was a supporter of Ranil Wickremesinghe because I was living in Colombo and I wanted peace. But I think we have to also accept that at least half the country sees it a different way. And I think Mr. Wickremesinghe now has a bit of a problem, because he sort of needs the votes of some of the nationalist base, because some of the Rajapaksa base has broken off to him. And there's also this idea that he might be in cahoots with them to some extent, right? So in a sense, he can't really say, well, I did my best, but the Rajapaksas made commitments on the international stage. They didn't hold on to them. I was the one that co-sponsored. When he talked about the hybrid courts, he didn't speak about it as if it was a good thing. He spoke about it as if, well, they did this, but then we didn't have support for it, so we had to not fulfill the foreign judges in the Human Rights Council. So, and imagine, this is a prime minister that agreed to co-sponsor a resolution that half the country sees as damaging to Sri Lanka's sovereignty. And whatever you may think of that, and I have disagreements with it, but that takes some kind of guts. But why didn't he bring that out? And the answer to that question, I think, is because there is a certain sort of nationalist element to this interview. It's meant to reinforce the narrative of Sri Lanka being under attack, and it just so happens it's coming out during the month of the UNHRC. So I have a feeling there's something a little deeper to this interview.
Do you want to counteract
He
that?
actually, he addressed that as well in the debriefing. I don't know if you watched it, but he said, look, some of the questions, and of course they were showing us snippets. I think this was on News First, and he said, look, a lot of the questions they asked me, I was not even in power at that point in time. It was not even in my hands, but I didn't say that because I was representing Sri Lanka, is what he said. For me, and again, it's because I'm pulling out, right? So Kusum is talking to you about the sort of nuances of national politics. For me, it's always geopolitics and pulling out. And for me, I felt that was in terms of statesmanship. It was an interesting point to sort of look at deeper because he was, in a way, keeping away from this sort of polarization that I'm talking about, because I feel like even if we're asking the question of journalism, or even if we're asking the question in this room between the three of us, I think polarization and sort of competitive name-calling, that the Western lens kind of leans onto, will get us nowhere. Right. And I felt that it was interesting that he said that. He said, look, I wasn't in power. They were asking me all of these questions. He was basically saying, I wasn't responsible for any of that. I was actually on the other side of it. But I didn't say it, which I felt was interesting.
What was that? That's something that struck me. Do you think the former president, Ranil Wickremesinghe, went into this interview with head-to-head, with not actually knowing what this entire show was about?
Yeah,
was he not prepared?
I thought the first part of it was interesting, the intro part, and he kind of, Mehdi Hasan gives it over to him, and then he says, yes, it was a difficult time, and I was tasked with this, and these are all of the things.
Disinflation
he
talks about.
Yeah, he talks about
it,
and then I think the next question that came, he said, okay, but I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about how I got Sri Lanka out of this economic crisis. And so I watched it a couple of times, and I watched that part specifically. And I thought, wow, it would be great to know what they told him he was coming there for.
My point is, if I can't imagine that a former president has a team that wouldn't check who the panelists were. I can't imagine they wouldn't check.
Even if you had a word from the network that it was going to be on a specific subject.
Yeah, I'm sure they would have. They should have told him at least who the panelists were, wouldn't they?
But he said that, right? He said that he was informed that it was somebody else on the panel, and they changed it last minute, and they didn't inform.
All three panelists, or the two other panelists, or one of them?
It was one of them, and that they hadn't informed.
The thing is,
so
if I was in politics for 45 years, and I lived through this whole boxing match between the narrative of the diaspora abroad and the single nationalist diaspora. He should know this if he's walking into London into an interview with Mehdi Hasan. This is going to come up.
But do you think they thought, because of the sort of work he had done, like for instance, there's one of the questions was about land returns, right? And I'm getting this information from a UN document. 92% of the lands they were talking about was returned to rightful owners at the beginning of 2023, which was under his tenure. So I'm just asking, do you think he went into it with this obviously a wrong understanding that, oh, I am one of the politicians who has done the most for minority rights, for reconciliation, whatever. He went in with that idea, and they actually brought him there with that kind of understanding in order to lay a trap almost. I don't know. That's one perspective.
I just think whatever you come to an interview with, if you should, anyone can think on their feet. We all have that ability, right? So you just mentioned the returning of 92% of the lands. We've resettled 95% of IDPs. He could have at least answered to someone used the word genocide, someone used the word ethnic cleansing. Say, I'm sorry, there is no evidence for genocide. There is no evidence for ethnic cleansing. You can't claim genocide when over 100,000 people flee the rebel-held separatist areas and come to the government side for sanctuary.
Can I bring up, and this is something that's come up in conversations, and I just want to sort of put it to you. See, I don't have any political affiliation, so I don't particularly terribly dislike or like any of our politicians. It doesn't irk me. But one of the conversations I've always noticed that comes up within Colombo communities is how former President Ranil Wickremesinghe, throughout his tenure in politics, doesn't connect with people in the way that other politicians do, right? And this has been described as, could it be based on a spectrum disorder? Could it be one of, I'm just saying. Right. I'm asking the question, if Mehdi Hassan's team, like you say, is so expert at doing what they're doing, that they have enough research to know who is sitting at the table, how to trigger the person, how they're going to respond in that sense. I'm just asking the question. I'm putting it out there.
You never know, right? These are very intelligent people, which is the point again. I hate to keep coming back to it, but you really should be prepared. And he has a team around him. There's no reason he shouldn't have a team of pretty good people who understand what's going on. And being in his position, now when you are a former president and prime minister, you would have been expected to have dealt with diplomacy before, somewhere in a 45-year career. So then an interview. Okay, forget about, Natasha's talking about the substance. Can I just talk about the style for like 2 minutes, right? You can't throw your hands up in there. You can't be like, no contest, I'm not going to answer your question. You can't say, oh, you're not letting me. Again, if you watched 1 or 2 episodes, you should know how to expect. And he even said, no, I know you, Mehdi. I know you like to corner people and shout at them. So if you knew all that, why did you sort of get caught to it? So it just seems that it was underprepared, whether it was arrogance. I don't know, but I feel like we should make this a thing in Sri Lanka where our leaders go abroad and actually meet a real journalist for a change and get some questions asked. We should make it a part of the culture.
I love that Kusum brought that up because it's something that I think about. Because like you said in the beginning, Ranil Wickremesinghe is considered within the Colombo community, at least, he's well spoken in terms of English.
His aristocracy as well.
Yeah, like if there's a accusation at him, or it's that he's elitist, that's sort of, but this idea of, okay, when you go and sit in a forum like that, which is Western, you are not going to fit in. Your accent is not going to fit in. And I want to bring this up in terms of how the Western lens has done this across time to Global South leaders. It's not just about Ranil Wickremesinghe. You can go to interviews from the past of the Rajapaksa administration. You can go to a recent interview from the BBC with the president of Guyana. You can go to interviews with the president of Rwanda. You can go further back to interviews with Nelson Mandela. And you can find this sort of string that connects them all, where at some point they're throwing their hands up in the air and saying, there is a measurement that you're using on us. There is a double standard that you're using on us that we will never be able to fulfill. We'll always be found wanting. And I think it's important to also look at that.
I would have thought this double standard thing would have come up, but he didn't actually use the words international double standard or anything like that. And I like that.
Yeah, he didn't.
I think that was a good thing. I think it's a bit like you go over there and you're like, oh, what about Iraq? It's the most obvious thing you can say. But you have to make some version of that argument. And I was really disappointed that he didn't take the opportunity to just say, war crimes can happen as a result of systemic sort of operational guidance that comes from the top. It can also happen on the battlefield, where generals make split, in a situational circumstance, you make a decision, and that could lead to a war crime. Now, the latter is likely what may have happened in Sri Lanka, where, for example, shelling of...
That's interesting, Kusum. So you think there were actual war crimes that were...
I think if
because
there were...
I found that there was a lot of information that he could have shared there that could have shut that down, which has, come to light in the last few years.
Let's talk about, for example, the safety zones, right? So the shelling of the safety zones of the hospital and the school. So these are things that you can bring up and say, there is some evidence of this. We don't have any evidence of operational commands coming down for this. There is no evidence for systematic military-wide objectives of ethnic cleansing, targeting civilians. If there is any evidence, you should take it up. Don't disparage a military that's fought a war for 30 years, made enormous sacrifices, and understand that wars are complicated and that we've seen it all over the world, and that post-war, Sri Lanka, while having shortcomings, we've done the resettlements. We've done some kind of... They've had elections. They've had representatives. So obviously, then come to the point of the 13th Amendment. And, whatever you think of the 13th Amendment, again, Ranil Wickremesinghe was for the 13th Amendment, for devolution of power. Why didn't he bring any of this up? I don't know. What do you think?
I actually think I've thought about it, and I've thought that there's a problem within the Sri Lankan political system, first of all, but within Sri Lankan society as well. Like, for instance, ask yourself the question, do you think that war crimes were committed during the end of that war? And it really comes down to doing your own research. It really comes down to reading the sort of reports. And like I said, it's a very protracted, complicated issue that you're dealing with. But if I can go on what Kusum said, during that interview, there was numerous times that the UN Human Rights Council and UN mechanisms were spoken of. And I think we have this sort of issue when we talk about the UN. We see it as a standalone entity, but it is essentially an intergovernmental organization run by member states, right? Okay, so let's keep that point there for a second. Let's deal with sort of mini points on some of the content that was said during the interview. They talked about the shelling of the hospital. Okay, in 2009, there was a cable that was leaked that was between the U.S. ambassador,
Blake.
No, Clint Williamson,
yes, Williamson.
Who was the U.S. ambassador to the UN, and the head of ICRC, Jack Mayo, for South Asia. In this cable, they talked about how the LTT was hiding weapons in a hospital. And every time the ICRC found out about it, they would confront them, and then they would say, okay, yeah, we will, and then they would move it to an even more worse place, and worse place meaning in terms of humanitarian law. Now, that was a leaked cable. Then there was a discussion in 2013 from Lord Naseby, who had kind of extracted from different... I'm giving you points that I think could have been mentioned to come to a better understanding, but also points that I think we as Sri Lankans should know so that we don't fall into this trap of thinking about it in the terms that they give it. So in 2013, Lord Naseby extracted from different reports. I think there was one UN report that had been retracted even, that gave numbers of the dead during the final stages, which sat perfectly well with what the Sri Lankan government was giving out, which was between 7,000 to 8,000. The 40,000 number came in the Darusman report, which was in 2010, and really where that number came from, nobody knows, but it's constantly used like a ping pong ball since then. Then in 2017, and I thought this was one of the most important, in 2017, Lord Naseby again found a cable which, under the backdrop of very sort of protracted legal mechanisms that he had to get out, which had been censored, which they didn't want to get out, which was sent from the UK defense attaché here. I think his name was Colonel Anthony Gash, I think was his name, where he talked about how the Sri Lankan government in the final stages of the war was doing everything in their power to protect civilians, was doing everything in their power, and he kind of lists out all of the measures that were taken, which is counter to this entire narrative of what at any point in time since 2009. But so now I'm going back to my other point about the UN. Why were these cables so repressed? Okay, you're looking at the Human Rights Council. The first resolution that was moved against Sri Lanka was in 2012. That was brought in, drafted, moved by the US. Okay, of course supported by the UK. In 2017, when all of these revelations happened, I think journalists from Ireland had reached out to the Human Rights Council and said, hey, are you going to retract the numbers of 40,000? Are you going to retract some of the stuff you said? Because these are the cables that have come out. And they said, well, the Human Rights Council is in the hands of the member states, so it will only happen then. Of course, by then, in 2015, Sri Lanka had signed on as a sponsor, which is what the discussion at this interview was. So you see, it's very sort of complicated. It's a complicated situation, but we also need to be clear in our minds of what it is. What I think happened at this interview is because of the sort of polarization that also happens here in Sri Lanka at the political level of name calling, okay, that then you no longer have the information to give, the data to give, because you've spent so much time saying, hey, those are the bad guys. Now you don't have the information to give,
Right.
which is what I thought happened.
Right.
Yeah.
It started off, just watching it from the start, I felt like it looked to me like the crowd was well balanced. Like they were like, oh, he's a little bit funny. He like Ranil was working the crowd. This guy was working. It started off well, but then as the interview kept going, I noticed that the crowd was in total disagreement with Ranil, and it was just him and Nurj Deva, the former parliamentarian from the European, was it the government? Yep. He was in part of government, right?
Yeah, and he was also an envoy, right?
Right, he was the envoy, yeah.
Envoy.
And he was like, you've got the wrong guy there. I mean, he was the only one standing up, but why do you think that is? Like, the entire crowd just shifted.
I think, to be honest, is what I mentioned before, is that Ranil Wickremesinghe's posturing wasn't really accommodating for that kind of crowd. And he wasn't being combative with substance. He was being combative with like his mannerisms and with his facial expressions. Right. And you have to sort of play ball a little bit. Politics is sometimes a spectator sport, and politics in the media is even more so. And you have to understand the dynamics of watching an interview on TV with an audience, how the applause lines come up, how people gasp, whether there's, and that energy in the room, I guess Ranil Wickremesinghe has just never been challenged like this, maybe not ever. So that's an important aspect. And I think what Natasha's pointed out is so important for Sri Lankans to just kind of understand, because I think we'll come to it later. I'd really like to hear your understanding of the comparison between what happened in the north of Sri Lanka and what's happening in Gaza, or what's happening in Gaza.
It's not the same at all.
Yeah, so we can talk about that a little bit.
Because that was brought up by not the journalist, but that was actually brought up by somebody in the audience, right? Where they were drawing comparison.
That was a question by Dr. Nandakumar. I think he's like a professor. But I think an important point that Sri Lankans need to understand, because I think at one point Mehdi Hasan also noted this, that Ranil Wickremesinghe said, we haven't had a civil war in 20 years. We are a non-violent nation. And I know when you say that, it sounds a bit ridiculous. It sounds a bit ridiculous in that room with everything that was coming out. But I think it's important to understand that Sri Lanka is a post-colonial nation, right? Post-colonial nations are almost, what they have in common is this like violent history. And that is a consequence of a long period of colonization. Sri Lanka is one of many post-colonial nations that has experienced, stages of extreme violence. There's no doubt about that. But just think about other post-colonial countries, right? Just have a broad view. Rwanda, Cambodia, Congo, Nigeria, Indonesia, Colombia, Algeria, Pakistan, apartheid South Africa, Myanmar, Bangladesh, Zimbabwe. These are all extremely violent. Many would say more violent than Sri Lanka. So when you get on the world stage, when someone says Sri Lanka is a country that's always been violent, you kind of have to correct them and say, hang on, Sri Lanka has violence. No one's saying Sri Lanka is like some paragon of peace. But our complexities are not uncommon in the post-colonial history. Right. It's not the exception, it's the rule, if you really think about it. And then you have to ask questions about what were the impacts of colonialism on these countries, their internal structures, and that sort of thing. So again, someone with Mr. Wickremesinghe's education levels, these are not complicated things to make. I mean, I'm not a scholar, but I can make a basic point about the post-colonial world. You have to do a lot of reading for this, right? So again, my question is, how did he end up there? And I think the other question that he has to bring up is, and I think this is sort of the nationalist angle on this, and I mean, maybe it's not a nationalist angle, I would like to hear what Natasha thinks. Sri Lanka has this problem of the 13th Amendment and the devolution project, right? Ranil Wickremesinghe was on one side of that, Mahinda Rajapaksa was on the other side of that. I don't know where Ranil Wickremesinghe stands right now. But 13th Amendment is highly contentious because the 13th Amendment, the provincial council system, comes from the Indo-Lanka Accord. And the Indo-Lanka Accord, many scholars believe, is sort of signed under duress, even though we invited the Indian peacekeeping forces. That invitation, many people suggest that might have been extracted from us, because at the time there was an airdrop of food supplies to Jaffna when they cut out the sea lanes. So this is where the Indian sort of export of the provincial council system of devolution, that part needs to be addressed, because it's a bit like talking about the war in Gaza and October 7th without really mentioning everything else that happened before that. Right. So this is where this final stages of the war conversation is extremely sort of convenient to a certain narrative, because you're all like, yes, the final stages of the war from January to May 2009. Oh, yeah, okay, it's a 30-year war. How did we get here? That wider conversation is almost forgotten now. The war crimes only seem to have begun in this final stage of the war. There's no larger macro conversation about where this came from, where did the LTT come from, what were the other groups, and I think Natasha will say more on that.
Yeah, I don't want to do a personal plug-in right now, but I'm going to.
Do it.
because of this question of why do we keep talking about the final stages when it was a very protected, complicated issue, which spans more than 30 years, really. But I've written extensively on it, of how the dynamics of, like I said, we're talking about Human Rights Council, but the mover and shaker of the resolution was the United States. And I've written extensively of how the US-Sri Lanka relationship changed under the Mahinda Rajapaksa administration, solely because of dependence towards China. And this is well known. You can read about it on Perspective South. The US has always used this, and you can see it very clearly also. They've used this idea of carrot and stick diplomacy. So they either give you a carrot to make you do what they want you to do, or they'll bring out a stick.
What is the stick used for?
To beat you into submission.
Dang.
But it's actually called the carrot and stick. Okay. If you watch Crown on Netflix, which I'm not watching right now, but if you do, you'll see the Winston Churchill character in it briefing the Queen, who at that point in time she's a young queen and she doesn't understand the context of the world. And he's talking about what is going to be the Cold War between Russia and the US. And he says the Americans either want to give you a carrot or they want to beat you with a stick in order, that's the diplomacy that they use, okay? So it's interesting, but why the final stages? Why the final stages? Because it was this specific administration that was leaning very heavily onto China at that time. I have an article, I could share it as well to go with this discussion. And all of the sort of Congress reports at the time, advisors to Senate, were all talking about Sri Lanka, not in the context of the final stages of the war, but of an over-dependency on China. And that is kind of what shifted the momentum and how that resolution at the Human Rights Council came into being. Yeah.
Yeah, this history is really, really interesting because I think the Mahinda Rajapaksa era was sort of, in many ways, painted by this shifting of Sri Lankan foreign policy, because Sri Lanka's foreign policy and the foreign policy of every country sort of is determined by its geography, right, where it exists in this world. We exist on the border of what's called a regional hegemon. India is a regional hegemon. This is their traditional sphere of influence. The same way Mexico and Canada are sort of in the United States sphere of influence, right? So this is why India is, first of all, the most important country to Sri Lanka, because they are the ones that are closest to us. And they're not just any other country. They're a behemoth. They have a huge military. And Sri Lanka has always sort of understood this dynamic. What happened from the Mahinda Rajapaksa era was that they understood, obviously, the nationalist point of view, where they know that the people that vote for them see India as sort of interfering in Sri Lanka's internal matters, that they favor one side over the other, that they're pushing for devolution, a separate state, all this stuff. And there's reasons for it, right? Because the LTT had its start with funding from Tamil Nadu. There's now plenty of evidence that it wasn't just the southern state that was supporting LTT training camps and recruitment. It was all over India. At one point, it went from 1 or 2 training centers in South India to about 35. There's one very famous RAW, that's the Research and Analysis Wing of India, the Indian Secret Service. There's a very famous base in Chakrata. There's another base called Establishment 22. These are all now documented. They trained members of the LTT for their operations. It's quite well known. I think there was a French dispatch 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, that talked about Indira Gandhi's plans to invade Sri Lanka with the paramilitary force and with the parachute force as well. So we have to understand the context of where all these things come from. And the Mahinda Rajapaksa government since 2005 shifted very steadily away from India because they realized that they could use China as sort of a bulwark against Indian influence, or at least a perception of Indian influence. So
I think it had to do also with the infrastructure, didn't it?
Of course. I mean, it's all part of the package,
post-conflict,
right?
all of that.
You get all this investment, you get all this, money coming in. And you also can tell India, we want to reconcile internally, but, it's a very complicated issue. Previously, India would say, well, we've got all this leverage over you. Now it became a fact of, well, if you can't come in to this project, we've got China. And India, I think, kind of slept on it a little bit, in my opinion, just looking at their foreign relations. I think they just missed the mark a little bit for about 5-6 years, and then suddenly woke up, and then you had people like Jai Shankar, real professionals in the foreign policy sphere, coming up, and then they kind of took control of the situation. So that's why you're seeing, Adani is the equivalent to the Chinese, CM ports or whatever. They're sort of a state-backed institution. But you have to look at this within the framing of geopolitics, and that's what's happened in London to Mr. Vikram Singh as well. It's like the geopolitical angle was kind of, it's the elephant in the room.
And I think it's always lost on our politicians.
I don't know, he should have brought that up. The geopolitical angle was a very open sort of target for him.
Yeah, but I feel like that's the problem with many of our politicians, that internally we get so caught up in the sort of party politics and fighting the different parties that they don't focus on facts about the end of the war or geopolitical factors because of party lines as well. And I think as Sri Lankans, we just need to all understand all aspects of that.
Right. I mean, speaking about party politics, I mean, if we're saying like publicly that they're supposed to be this, like they're supposed to be their own party, right? They're not supposed to be these friends, but he kept bringing up this thing about
the birthday party.
The party singing. Well, so help me understand this context.
This is where I agree with Natasha, because that was a really cheap point.
Yeah.
Right?
So help me understand.
It was sort of like, look at the optics, and everything was. If that is one of the main things you're going to talk about, then you're an optics sort of focused. You're not really focusing on the substance. You're focusing on how it looks like. And that's very clearly playing to an audience, playing to a narrative like Natasha was talking about. And that's something that he tried to shut down. But I think, I don't know how you'd have handled that. I think it was complicated, but I think it was a cheap shot. And I feel like that kind of denigrated the whole thing a little bit.
Yeah.
How would you have handled that? Because it's a tough one, right? Because you
I'll
do...
handle it. I'll handle it right now, actually.
Yeah. I did like the context, though, of like where he did say, in Sri Lanka.
Because
we know each other.
But that's the point, right? Yeah. We have a culture here. We have a certain culture, and it differs from person to person. It also differs from province to province. How I got from A to B or to be here at this podcast will be very different from how Kusum got here or you, Jason, right? The context is different, but really there is a culture. So I'm part of a community. I'm just going to use this example from my personal life. I'm part of a community, a church, where there is a diverse group of people. And if we sit down to talk about politics, I can't tell you how diverse the views are. I can't tell you how the lines are sort of drawn, right? But we can sit at the table and have the discussion. I can hear the other person out without saying, no, that is not right. No, because it's different voices that feed in to a discussion. And honestly, I go for their birthday parties and they come for mine and they sing happy birthday. And what an amazing community that is to be available to people who have different views from you, who have extremely different views from you, to be able to sit at one place and say, look, we're friends. And we can look at this issue that we have differing views on, but we can look at it and we can talk about it and we can feed into it. And I think that's the sort of groundwork that as a country we need to try and lay down for reconciliation.
Right.
Yeah.
I like that. I like that answer because it is true, right? Like you can poke fun at somebody singing at somebody's birthday party, but the context is
I'm surprised they didn't bring up the Royal Thomian because the Royal Thomian, usually you have all of our politicians standing there having a drink together, singing really bad Sinhalese songs. Like,
can I tell you the left perspective
of
this, right?
Yeah.
It's Mehdi Hasan is sort of making a critique of elitism.
No, it's also because he's talking about this terminology of dictator. Are you holding hands with? It's always that terminology. It's genocide,
if I
dictators.
Can, steelman Mehdi Hasan for a second, right? Because I think we've said we have to about his style and integrity and all of that. But I would like to just point out that in terms of like Mehdi Hasan's style, again, I keep coming back to his style. And if this particular question of the birthday cake came up, I mean, Ranil Wickremesinghe has called Mahinda Rajapaksa and the Rajapaksas by name through an entire 2-year campaign. He's called them every name you can in the book.
And that is part of the problem of why he got stuck. And
exactly.
I think any one of them would have got stuck up there because of those same reasons.
And I think for Mr. Wickremesinghe, if he doesn't care about the optics, it tells you something about where he's at in his career, right? He understood the optics of that. And he decided, I don't care. Because that Yahapanya period for me is so now far removed from him.
I feel like it's a bigger issue that we really need to look at, and I feel like it's because we need to change the political culture in Sri Lanka.
Yeah. So I want to just push on this a little bit and just ask. So, for example, Ranil Wickremesinghe has never openly, I guess, called Mahinda Rajapaksa a war criminal. That's probably the only thing he hasn't done, right? But he has talked about corruption. He's talked about billions being stolen by the Rajapaksas.
But every administration that comes before there's a changeover, they always come with that. It's the same discussion during Chandrika's time.
The Yahapalya was very specifically about good governance and corruption of the Rajapaksas specifically.
Yes, but doesn't every administration that newly comes in always come with this discussion of they've done this, they've done this, they've done this,
unique in its,
and then you come in and then people are like, okay, why aren't you arresting them? Why aren't you doing this? And because it's a case of, it's just stuff that we've just said in order to get into power. Don't you agree that we need to change that political culture?
I personally think that when you look at all the evidence that's out there in terms of the infrastructure projects and the grift that was happening, the white elephant projects from the port to the airport, in terms of a political point of view, that Yahapalya campaign was kind of like accurate about the situation in the country, as it were, in terms of the infrastructure and where we were heading economically. So my point is always that you came in on this good governance shtick. So why didn't you deliver any good governance? Like within a few months, that good governance thing was out of the window. So where is this conversation? It's the same thing of this current NPP government. The NPP and the JVP have sort of existed to talk about corruption. That's been their whole thing for the last 10 years. So when you come to it, I can't blame them for making that critique and making their entire political existence about corruption, fraud, mismanagement, waste of money, and all that. But I expect when you come to power that you do something about it and you stick to your word. Is this something we need to change in our politics? I just think politics is usually about the lowest, it's about the lowest hanging fruit. And I think in 2014-15, corruption and the excesses and the lack of governance of the Rajapaksas was kind of like the lowest hanging fruit. So I don't think I can blame that government for taking that on.
I think it's a game
It
that
is a game.
different
Politics is a
political
game, 100%.
parties play,
100%, yeah.
which is why I said, as Sri Lankans, we need to be better educated because
Yeah,
you can't
definitely.
rely on the politicians to give you all the facts. You need to find it for yourself because they're not even extracting it for themselves. And I think that there is really a need. I think even with every change that comes in the country, it comes from a point of view of voters thinking, we need a change, we need a change, we need a change. But it is a change from this sort of political culture. And I think if we don't get to that point of being able to have a conversation, nothing will change. It'll just be the same thing over and over again.
Let's talk about the timing of this entire thing. I found it a little bit convenient, and maybe both of you can enlighten me on this. So this piece comes out. This comes out, YouTube, it's blowing up, you're getting a lot of views, and I'm starting to see, obviously, things about Ranil's past. I mean, the Batalanda report comes out. You have, the IMF congratulating the current sitting president. What a great job you've done. Congratulations on bringing this economy out of the dumps. So it almost feels like, again, this is just my perspective from what I saw. It's almost like you're trying to discredit who he is, the former president is, what he's done, and kind of just say, hey, congratulations to the current president for doing all of that hard work. What do you both think about the timing of this whole thing?
From the point of view of for himself, from his team, when you're going on one of these interviews, that would be what you focus on. If I was advising him, I'd be on bring everything back to the economy. Say that every time I come into power, I have to deal with an economic mess. And then that's a national question as well. And most of the time when I try to solve the economy, I become, and he kind of touched on this in his first answer, it's every time I try to solve the economic problem, people struggle economically because because the problem is that his view of fixing the economy is always contracting the economy, disinflation, that kind of thing. So if he was going to bring this sort of argument up, it would have helped him at least reframe this narrative and take the conversation away from the war crimes aspect. But I don't think that was ever an option for him in this interview. I think they were always going to get him on this particular point of view. If you ask for me personally, I think the idea that he saved the country is just, that's like one of these things that I think some percentage of the country will believe, whereas the majority of the country will just realize that was not the reality of what happened. I think it was an opportunistic move that he made. All the evidence suggests that the entire opposition was preparing to had already dealt with Gotabaya as one, and it was very much sort of a backdoor maneuver by Mr. Wickremesinghe. Fair play to him, he said it himself, power is something that should be grabbed. Those were his words, so, yeah.
Yeah, I think the interview in terms of pulling out again and framing it, I feel like it really didn't have anything to do with him, per se. I feel like he was, I don't know if I could use this line, but easy target or a well-studied subject to use on that platform. But I think the bigger picture is it was about pushing a narrative about Sri Lanka, which has been happening since 2009. And I think it's just one more interview that feeds into that larger sort of piece where then words such as genocide, atrocities, all of these things are used. And I really want to say, I think Kusum said it as well, we have, and I think I've said it on a different podcast with you, Jason, we have massive problems here. We have issues, Every country has issues, but when you frame it in the dire negative, you're not getting the full picture and you're not going to solve any of the issues. And if you're going to weaponize human rights, the countries with the guns to their heads are going to try to pay more attention and energy to move that gun away rather than actually deal with the issues they have on the ground. And we don't have the capacity. I really don't think we have enough people. We don't have enough funds. We don't have enough support to be able to do that. And I think that's what should be really the focus of the international community in a certain sense. I'm not saying that there should be ignoring, but there should be a move away from this sort of narrative and polarization.
And it was a perfect opportunity because he was in London. He could have pointed out that London is the one of the epicenters of LTT propagandizing, fundraising, planning, organizing, and it's well documented, right? So you would bring that up and say, I think there's some line somewhere in history where the LTT was one of many militant separatist Tamil organizations that were legitimately fighting some kind of oppression. But there's somewhere in history, maybe somewhere in the 80s, where the LTT crossed over, where you saw them basically kill all of the competition, anyone that was moderate, not just rival parties, but members of the Sri Lankan government, anyone who was moderate. They kind of assumed the mantle of a maximalist organization. And the next step was terrorism, which was very early on in their history. And I think once an organization moves into that sort of territory, if you're going to London, you should kind of bring that up and be like, where do you guys think the LTTE came from? Where do you guys think they were an organization that had tens of millions of pounds in a budget? There were front organizations, charities that were essentially fundraising so that Prabhakaran could send suicide bombers to villages and buses in the commercial centers around Sri Lanka. You could bring up any of these things. And these are not difficult. There's nothing for him to lose in bringing these things up. So I just think that this was an opportunity on a global stage with a very famous a journalist who is
I think you were right.
A Freudian slip. But this is Mehdi Hasan at his peak. This is probably, he's at his peak. And you had a chance to really sort of change the narrative around Sri Lanka and sort of tell people, look, the LTT were the first people to develop suicide bombings on a mass scale. Right. They recruited brainwashed children, pregnant women, strapped bombs to themselves and exploded themselves in offices, right? They targeted innocent villages in buses. They targeted religious sites. Again, not political or military targets. Bring this stuff up. I mean, this is not complicated. Yeah. Because the fact is that the LTT was a terrorist organization prescribed in the country he was seated at. So at least make the nationalist attack and be like, are you pro-LTT? At least say that. I mean, take the cheap shot if you're getting fired from all angles, but he didn't do any of that. So I don't understand what his game plan was. I feel like he lost his strategy.
You explain the progression of the LTT really beautifully, right? But I really don't think they would have given him the space or the time.
Instead of that Buddhist story, he could have told that.
He could have. I mean,
but then again,
it took a good 5 minutes to make that point. I mean, they gave him all the time in the world to talk about that.
But then again, we don't know what that 2 hours was about.
Exactly.
I agree.
Yeah.
But again,
it's 49 minutes from 2 hours.
Again, you should know, your team should know, every debate like this, it's a longer debate that's cut down to suit YouTube, TV, and all that, right?
Jason, please pick the right path.
Or at least you should say, okay, you release your version.
Yeah.
Give us the ability to release our version.
Yeah.
And then people can decide.
Sure.
I don't know if any of this was ever discussed.
Can I just jump in on something Kusum was talking about the LTT? Because, so another point that has been brought up on this interview is, all of the different aspects that could have been mentioned, and some of those points we've already gone through. But on the LTTE, I don't think there has been an example like Sri Lanka of what was done with, I think, 12,000 LTT cadres at the end of the war in terms of what the government said was rehabilitation. And at that point, everybody screamed, no, it's not, it's detention camps, it's wrong, it's everything. But the Sri Lankan government actually put in there was education, there was psychological counseling. There were cadres who actually got married while they were there. They did their O-levels, they did their A-levels. 12,000 LTT cadres, and there are amazing examples of it.
I can stand with that because I've actually been to some of these rehabilitation homes as well.
That's amazing, Jason. You should do a video on it. I know that there were 3 cadres who were actually taken for the South Asian Games to represent Sri Lanka in sharpshooting. I mean, those examples really, but the world doesn't know about it, and the world doesn't want to hear about it. There's nothing.
Well, I think we have to blame our people as well.
Exactly.
We have to get this out there. We've just got this one narrative of the war, and everything that even the conversation. I would have expected some right-wing nationalist group in Sri Lanka to make a movie about the glorification of our armed forces. Just do a one-sided narrative. Even that isn't there. I don't know what's going on with this. There's very few national documentaries that are produced by Sri Lanka.
But I think that's why, Kusum, we as Sri Lankans, as civilians, need to educate ourselves, because I think the Sri Lankan government has never been good at communication. The American government does it amazingly, but of course they have the resources, they have the money, they have the people, they have Hollywood, they have everything for it,
media,
right?
I think, they understand
They do,
it.
but I mean, we can't be also blamed for not having, we can't blame RW that he's not Obama, is what I'm saying. We can't do it. If we go there, we're stepping on a very slippery slope. But I think as Sri Lankans, we can educate ourselves. We can start telling the stories because we talked about the ills of social media, but there are the good stuff about social media, and everybody has a camera, everybody has a voice now. You can tell those stories, you can feed into that, but you have to do your research, and you have to learn, and you have to also express what it is to be Sri Lankan for you.
I love that.
I'd also like to just, if you have a little more time,
please,
just a few minutes on this.
I'm
sure you want to talk about the question by Dr. Nandakumar regarding Mr. Vikramasinghe's comments on Palestine and how we keep saying
I know you wrote something about this as well.
Yeah, I did, and I did my best to explain this. But most people are trying to make this conversation about Palestine equated to the conversation about Sri Lanka. So where there's not much overlap, right? So they're confusing the right to self-determination versus the right to a nation state, which are two completely different prospects. And then the idea becomes sort of emotional, right? Why don't they deserve a nation state? Well, it's about someone's right to a nation state versus the right of everybody else to retain their nation state as it exists.
Right.
And you can't put one right above the other. That's why the international system is complicated like that. So it's not like a moral failing. It shouldn't be framed as like this moral question and all the Sri Lankans, the majority of Sri Lankans are on the wrong side of this moral equation. And that's another thing I know, again, I can't expect Ranil to talk about these things, but it's so important to sort of understand that the narrative that the international media is portraying, and that question was so loaded, you could at least correct the basis for that question, because it's not complicated, right?
I think he tried to, right? He did mention, he did talk about it. And anyway, this whole discussion comes from, in international law per se, it comes from the 1960s, which is the decolonization movement, right? So it's coming also from the context of that. It's coming from newly colonized states who were suppressed, repressed under a colonizer. And even in international law, there has to be a sort of identification of that. Palestine is a state.
Under international law.
Under international law, right?
Right.
Sri Lanka, that context is not there at all. If you hear the different entities of the UN, of different countries, talking about the Palestine issue, they talk about the two-state solution, okay? There is no such understanding in terms of Sri Lanka. But like I said before, do we have problems? My gosh, yes. Okay, do we need to solve them? Yes. But can we do it in a better way? Yes. I feel like that's few years still down the line. But we as Sri Lankans, we're so... I need to say this just before we close,
Sure.
Our ability to make memes about very serious issues within a couple of seconds, okay? that needs to be looked at, because there's obviously a lot of people with a lot of time on their hands. Can we take them and use them for a deeper discussion? Humor is such a great way to start a conversation. Of course, these are difficult issues. We're talking about minority issues. We're talking about people who have lost their lives. We're talking about internal conflict, right? But we need to start talking about our stories, our perspectives, because that is where the healing begins. Yeah.
And if I can also close up on just
Please.
telling the government to kind of notice that Sri Lanka's reputation suffered in that interview. And it's incumbent upon the government to send somebody and say, look, we don't know about Mr. Wickramasinghe, but here's our representative, and we'd like to face some of the questions that you are asking. And send someone, that's what I would do it, she would do it. There's so many other people who would do it, but okay, we're not in the NPP, we're not part of the government, so send someone who's prepared, who has the substance, and sort of try to change this narrative around Sri Lanka and the final stages of the war, because right now it's really damaging to Sri Lanka in every sort of way, because our tourism depends on it, our interactions and engagements in multilateral organizations depend on it, and I guarantee you our internal politics will once again start depending on the national question very soon.
Right. Thank you, Kusum and Natasha. I hope this episode on I'm No Expert has given you the tools and the information from both sides for you to form your own decision, a more, I would say, informed decision. Before we judge, before we put out any political statement on Facebook, we actually take the time to understand the full context of something and dish it out ourselves. So in true Sri Lankan fashion, Enang kollo, api giya.
Thank you.
Like, look at their faces. They're just like, oh God, he did it.
All of that good content.
What about the kello?
Yeah, exactly. The killer.
Oh, that's good. Huh? It's a very good session. Kusum,
Yeah.
very good
Fun.
having
I
you
enjoyed
here.
it.
That was
Really
wonderful,
enjoyed it.
guys.
Very good.